In the remote hills of East Texas, where the pine forests meet endless plains, there once stood a series of camps that promised salvation to the damned. Between 1845 and 1881, over 300 souls entered these so-called redemption camps seeking forgiveness for their sins, but only a handful ever left alive. The few survivors spoke in hushed voices of purification rituals so brutal that death itself seemed merciful. When federal investigators finally breached the camps in 1881, they uncovered horrors far beyond religious fanaticism: a secret cemetery holding the remains of nearly 200 victims, each bearing clear signs of prolonged torture. But what truly shook the foundations of frontier justice was what they found next: the Damnation family's private ledgers, which revealed a criminal enterprise so sophisticated it had operated undetected for over 3 decades. Tonight, we uncover the full story of the most prolific serial killers in American frontier history, and the twisted salvation they offered to the desperate and the damned. Before we continue with the tale of the Damnation family and their reign of terror disguised as redemption, let me ask you this. Are you brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history? This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who dare stare into the abyss. If you're one of them, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. The truth we're about to expose will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the terrible price of redemption on the American frontier. The year was 1845. Texas had just joined the Union as the 28th state after nearly a decade as an independent republic. The frontier was a vast, lawless expanse where desperate men and women fled their pasts, seeking either redemption or ruin. It was a land where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came at the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned as hot as the summer sun. Along the dusty trails connecting isolated settlements scattered across hundreds of miles, word began to spread of 3 brothers who promised something priceless to the wicked: immediate salvation through purification of the flesh. They were known as the Damnation family: preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebodiah. The brothers had arrived in Texas from Arkansas in early 1845, carrying glowing letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations throughout the South. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look straight into a man's soul. His jet-black hair was always immaculately groomed, and his voice carried an eerie power that could make even hardened killers weep like children. At 35, he was the eldest and the most charismatic, a master orator who could deliver sermons that left his flock both terrified and exhilarated. 2 years younger, evangelist Cornelius possessed an uncanny gift for reading guilt written on a person's face. He could pinpoint a man's secret sins with such unsettling accuracy that many believed he had supernatural insight. His thin frame and sunken cheeks only deepened his reputation for spiritual otherworldliness. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers called confession extraction, forcing sinners to reveal their darkest secrets. The youngest brother, prophet Jebodiah, claimed he received visions directly from the Almighty. At 28, he was built like a blacksmith, with huge hands he swore were blessed with healing power. His role was to oversee the physical side of purification, ensuring each penitent received precisely the suffering their sins demanded. Together, they offered the frontier's desperate and guilty a terrible bargain: salvation bought through blood, pain, and secrets that would never see the light of day. Until now, they built their network of redemption camps along the most desolate fringes of East Texas, where the murky cypress swamps bled into the piney woods and civilization seemed no more than a fever dream. From a distance, the camps looked humble enough. Circles of canvas tents pitched with ritual precision around rough-hewn wooden crosses, a central fire pit forever crackling where the brothers preached their merciless gospel to gatherings of lost, desperate souls. The clientele was exactly what one might expect on the lawless frontier: cowboys evading rustling charges, whores fleeing brutal pimps, gamblers drowning in debts they could never repay, fugitives with blood on their hands, deserters from the Mexican War and skirmishes with Indian tribes. But the camps drew more than just outlaws. Respectable merchants, cornered by fraud, politicians on the run from corruption scandals, even true seekers of salvation lured by whispered tales of miracles, each hoping the Damnation brothers could wash their sins clean. They preached a gospel of brutal cleansing that matched the frontier's own savage heart. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire, Malachi would roar, his voice echoing through the pines as flame light flickered across his angular face. The flesh must suffer so the spirit can soar. There is no easy road to paradise, only the narrow path of pain. Word of the brothers' miraculous transformation spread like wildfire through Texas and beyond. Frontier newspapers printed breathless testimonials. Hard-bitten killers emerging gentle as lambs, drunkards pure as mountain snow, each reborn and dispatched to spread the word to the furthest corners of the earth. But in August of 1847, when the summer heat clung to the pines like a fever, the first troubling whispers began to surface, though few paid them any mind. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled half-dead into Marshall, Texas, muttering in broken whispers of horrors witnessed at a redemption camp near the shadowy waters of Caddo Lake. Hartwell's appearance alone was enough to send a chill through those who'd known him before. Once a robust man in his 30s, he now looked twice that age, gaunt, hollow-eyed, hair gone stark white, hands trembling like wind-shaken leaves. Loud noises made him flinch like a beaten dog. But it was his eyes that unsettled folks most, bright blue once, now drained and empty, like he'd stared too long into something no man should ever see. His tale came in fragments, murmured between bouts of catatonic silence that could last for hours, or shrieking nightmares that woke the whole town. The local pastor, William Matthews, took him in, hoping prayer might ease the man's tortured mind. Each night, Hartwell woke screaming about the pit of purification and the screams that never stopped. When he could speak clearly, he told Matthews how he'd come to the camp, burdened by guilt for killing a man in a saloon fight over a crooked card game. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, Hartwell whispered in the hush of the church. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and spoke every secret I'd ever buried, things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I stole from my mother before I left Arkansas. He knew about the woman I left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything. The cleansing began the moment he arrived. New penitents were stripped of every earthly possession, even their clothes, and clad in scratchy burlap robes. One by one, they were forced to confess, not just the sin that brought them to the camp, but every trespass, every shame, no matter how small. Brother Cornelius sat across with his great black ledger, scribbling it all down. If he suspected you were holding back, Brother Jebodia would help you remember. Those hands of his, Hartwell muttered, voice flat as if quoting scripture, could make you feel pain you couldn't imagine. Some men spent days confessing, weeks, even. Only when the brothers believed every sin had been unearthed would the physical purification begin. A week-long fast, nothing but water, while the penitent dug his own grave, a symbol of his spiritual death. The hunger was nothing, Hartwell said, his body trembling at the memory. It was what came after. They called it the trial of fire. Leather whips studded with bits of metal. Each lash a sin torn from your flesh. The whippings could go on for hours, days even, until the sinner could barely stand. And still it did not end. Hartwell spoke of ritual burials. Men laid in the graves they had dug, buried alive but for their faces. Some lay gasping beneath the dirt for minutes. Some for hours. The brothers prayed over them, chanting proclamations of spiritual death and rebirth. Some of them never came back up, Hartwell whispered, eyes wide and far away. Brother Malachi would stand there and say they'd been called home to glory. I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. The most horrifying part of Hartwell's testimony was his account of those who didn't survive what the Damnation brothers called the purification process. According to Hartwell, the brothers preached that death during purification was the ultimate blessing, proof that the soul had been cleansed so perfectly that God himself had called it straight to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died, Hartwell recalled. Brother Malachi would read from the Bible while Brother Jebodia covered the grave with earth. Then they'd plant a wooden cross and add the dead person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones, they'd skipped purgatory entirely. Local authorities in Marshall were quick to dismiss Hartwell's claims as the ravings of a man undone by guilt and frontier madness. No one had come forward to report missing kin, and the Damnation brothers carried impeccable credentials. Letters of recommendation from churches all across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and glowing testimonials from families who swore their loved ones had been transformed by the brothers' ministry. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a practical man well acquainted with frontier violence, remained unconvinced. "The frontier's full of men running from something," he told Pastor Matthews. "Sounds to me like Hartwell found religion the hard way and cracked under the strain. These revival preachers get mighty enthusiastic, but murder? That's a mighty big claim without proof." And so the matter was quietly dropped. Within a month, Hartwell himself had vanished. Some said he'd moved on to California. Others whispered he'd slunk back to Arkansas. Pastor Matthews suspected something darker, but with no evidence, his hands were tied. Meanwhile, the redemption camps continued unhindered, their reputation for miraculous conversions only growing. Hartwell's disappearance was just the first in a troubling pattern that would unfold over the coming decades. As the years passed, the legend of the Damnation brothers spread like wildfire through the South and beyond. They boasted of saving over 1,000 souls, transforming drunks, gamblers, and criminals into shining examples of piety, then sending them out to carry the gospel to the farthest reaches of the frontier. Letters poured into newspapers from Texas to Louisiana, each praising the brothers for their miraculous work. The stories all sounded the same. A desperate sinner would arrive at a redemption camp, undergo purification, and emerge reborn. So reborn, in fact, that they felt called to bring salvation to the wildest, most remote places. California, Oregon, the Rocky Mountains, deep into Indian Territory. Final letters home spoke of an overwhelming urge to spread the word and often included pleas for money to support this holy mission. But for those who looked closer, cracks began to show. The camps never stayed put for more than 6 months, always following God's call to reach new sinners, or so the brothers claimed. This constant movement made tracking them nearly impossible for lawmen already stretched thin across the vast, lawless frontier. More troubling were the families who sent wayward sons and daughters to the camps, only to receive letters months later claiming their loved ones had been transformed, and then vanished into distant territories, never to be seen or heard from again. The brothers always had explanations. Sometimes they even had forged letters to cover the gaps. Mrs. Eleanor Westbrook of New Orleans was among the first to question their story. Her son Thomas, a gambling addict with debts closing in, disappeared after joining a redemption camp near Shreveport in 1849. At first, the letters came regularly. Thomas wrote of his newfound faith, his joy in spreading the gospel, his plan to minister in California. There were enough personal details to seem genuine, and Thomas even asked for money to support his mission. "At first, I was overjoyed," Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been on a dark path, and these letters made it sound like he'd found salvation. But the handwriting, it looked like his, but something was off. The way he shaped certain letters. The phrases he used. I began to think someone was copying his hand. She hired a private investigator to find Thomas in California. What he found was worse than she feared. None of the churches or missions Thomas claimed to work for had ever heard of him. The addresses in his letters either didn't exist or belonged to strangers who knew nothing of Thomas Westbrook or his ministry. Similar stories soon began to surface across the frontier. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who treated numerous survivors from the camps, began to notice a disturbing pattern in their conditions. Instead of the peaceful demeanor of the spiritually redeemed, they wore the hollow stare of those who had endured unspeakable horrors. She would later testify before a federal tribunal that the few who returned to civilization were irrevocably altered, but not in the way the Damnation brothers claimed. They spoke little, flinched at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to voice. Most unsettling of all was their universal refusal to discuss what had happened at the camps, as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. In her notes, Dr. Thornton described several cases that haunted her deeply. Jacob Miller, once an outlaw who had survived what the brothers called the purification process, displayed the same shattered nerves she had seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake screaming about the pit and a ritual he called the ceremony of ascension. When she pressed him for details, he would only mutter that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. Then there was Sarah Colby, a woman who had sought redemption after abandoning her children to a life of prostitution. She returned to her family a hollow shell of her former self. Her sister Mary told Thornton that Sarah would spend hours staring into empty space, whispering prayers that were unlike any she'd heard, begging God to forgive her not for her past deeds, but for the things she had seen. Perhaps the most telling was Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation brothers' methods, hoping to adapt them for his own ministry. Hawkins had gone in as a spiritual guide and impartial witness, not as a penitent, yet he emerged just as broken as the others. "There are forms of evil that wear the mask of righteousness," he told Dr. Thornton during one session. "I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God, they are something else entirely. They prey on our deepest spiritual needs, turning them into weapons against us." When asked for specifics, Hawkins refused to elaborate, claiming that to speak openly would only endanger anyone tempted to dig deeper. All he would say was that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation, and everything to do with exploiting the vulnerable. The pattern of disappearances and traumatized survivors continued through the 1850s and into the 1860s, concealed by the chaos of the Civil War. With whole populations displaced and communication in tatters, it became easy for people to vanish without a trace. But when the war ended, so too did the brothers' perfect cover. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the war's close, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began to unravel the mystery. Morrison was meticulous with a background in military intelligence, and he saw what others had missed: a trail of disappearances that moved across East Texas in step with the so-called redemption camps. He had been assigned the case after Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana filed a formal complaint. His nephew had entered a damnation camp near the Texas border and never returned. Unlike local sheriffs with little reach or funding, Morrison had the authority and resources to conduct a sweeping, multi-state investigation. "Something here doesn't add up," Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. "I've tracked over 60 missing persons in the last 3 years alone, all tied to these camps. That's not counting older cases, or others lost to bad record-keeping in neighboring states." Morrison interviewed dozens of families whose loved ones had gone seeking redemption. The stories were eerily similar. For weeks, letters would arrive describing a profound spiritual rebirth, then suddenly stop, usually with one final letter claiming the convert had been called to missionary work in some remote, unreachable corner of the frontier. But when Morrison tried to verify these missions, he found the addresses were fake and the churches had no record of the supposed missionaries. More damning still, he found that many of the letters from grateful families contained identical phrases and repeated the same spelling mistakes. "Someone is manufacturing these testimonials," Morrison wrote in a confidential memo to his superiors. "The question is whether we're looking at fraud, kidnapping, or something even darker." His breakthrough came in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas, where he met a drunken man named Tobias Fletcher. Fletcher had once worked as a gravedigger and laborer for the Damnation brothers in the mid-1870s. Slumped over his bottle, his voice trembling, Fletcher confessed, "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," he whispered. "Brother Malachi told me. I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls," Fletcher began, voice trembling, "but some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled, permanently. He'd pray over them, declare another soul saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried down there." According to Fletcher, his duties weren't just to dig the symbolic graves used in the brothers' so-called purification rites. He was also ordered to dispose of the bodies of those who ascended during these rituals. The brothers preached that these souls had reached such perfect spiritual cleansing that God had called them home right there in the dirt. But Fletcher had seen too many corpses to mistake murder for miracles. "The way Brother Jebediah worked with his hands," Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to a fearful whisper, "he called it healing. But I saw what those hands could really do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every scrap of information about family, money, land. And when they'd squeezed him dry, he'd finish it." What Fletcher described went far beyond backwoods murder. It was organized, almost professional. The brothers used torture to pry out details about a victim's assets and kin, then forged letters to families, begging for money under the guise of holy missionary work. They gave plausible excuses for why their missionaries couldn't come home, always too busy spreading the gospel in God-forsaken places. And the money kept coming. Families sent funds for years, never knowing their sons and daughters lay rotting in unmarked graves, their names spoken only in false prayers. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for the graves' exact locations, the man's drunken bravado cracked. His eyes darted around the tavern's shadows as if expecting the Damnation brothers to crawl out of the dark. "They got eyes everywhere," Fletcher stammered, his voice gone small. "People who poke around too much. They disappear. I shouldn't have said nothin'. God help me, I shouldn't have said nothin'." He fled the tavern that night and vanished. Some swore he'd run west to California. Others whispered he'd turned up dead in the swamps near Cathow Lake. Morrison suspected the latter. But Fletcher had told him enough to narrow the search to a patch of cursed ground near the Louisiana border, where the brothers were rumored to be building their next camp. Armed with this new intelligence and a growing stack of grim evidence, Morrison knew it was time to move. He gathered a small team of trusted rangers: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a battle-hardened veteran of the Indian Wars; Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero whose tracking skills were unmatched; and Private David Thompson, a young sharpshooter with steady hands and a steadier nerve. Morrison trusted these men not just for their skill, but for their silence. Word of this couldn't reach the wrong ears. Their journey took them deep into the forbidding forests and cypress swamps of East Texas, where the canopy swallowed daylight and the wet air turned sound to whispers. Along the way, they found signs that something was profoundly wrong. Wildlife was scarce. Even the biting insects that usually plagued travelers in these parts seemed to avoid the place. At a trading post near Marshall, an old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh tried to turn them back. "Ain't nothin' natural about that place," Marsh rasped. "Been huntin' these woods 30 years, ain't seen no land like that. Animals steer clear, and the ones that don't, they come back wrong, if they come back at all." His warnings matched what Morrison had heard before: trees twisting in unnatural shapes, woods gone silent as a graveyard. Some blamed old Indian burial grounds or restless spirits, but Morrison suspected a simpler horror: too many buried bodies poisoning the earth itself. The Rangers camped miles from the supposed redemption site. Morrison's plan was clear: observe, gather ironclad proof, then strike. He knew the brothers' reputation for piety would shield them unless the evidence was beyond denial. On their first night, the proof came on the wind. Faint but unmistakable. Screams. Pleading. Somewhere amid it, a low chant in a tongue none of them recognized, half prayer, half curse, carried through the trees toward their campfire. The Rangers listened in grim silence, each man understanding the same truth. Whatever lay ahead near Cathow Lake, the brothers of Damnation weren't saving souls. They were burying them. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write in his official report. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, only to start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. The screaming continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes joined by the sound of digging and what seemed to be some kind of ritual ceremony. When dawn finally broke, Morrison and his men mustered the courage to conduct a preliminary sweep of the area. What they found in the woods surrounding the camp would challenge everything they thought they knew about the true extent of the Damnation family's crimes. Fresh graves dotted the clearing like a macabre garden, far too many to be dismissed as symbolic relics of some twisted rite. Morrison counted over 60 graves that looked to have been dug within the past year alone, each marked by a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But it was the smell that convinced him they had stumbled onto something truly horrific. Despite the brothers' apparent attempts to manage their burial ground, the unmistakable stench of decomposition hung heavy in the humid dawn air. Private Thompson, who had served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts, confirmed Morrison's grim suspicion. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain," Thompson reported, his face pale. "Fresh ones, and old ones too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time." As the Rangers crept closer to the camp itself, new sounds chilled their blood. From the largest tent came the rhythmic thud of metal striking flesh, a man's agonized screams punctuated by calm, almost conversational chanting, religious incantations, spoken as if they were everyday words over breakfast. The contrast was obscene, a victim's raw suffering framed by a tone of gentle piety. Morrison realized they were witnessing an active torture session, probably part of the purification process that Fletcher had described. The Ranger captain faced an impossible decision: intervene immediately and risk losing the evidence they needed to expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes, or allow the horror to continue while they gathered proof. The decision was made for him when the screaming stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that somehow felt worse than the noise that had come before. Morrison knew they'd just heard a man's final moments. There was no saving that soul now. Their priority had to be preventing more deaths. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter of the camp. What they observed over the next several hours would form the backbone of one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The Damnation brothers operated with the precision of a seasoned enterprise. Everything followed a strict schedule, betraying years of practice and refinement. Each morning began with what seemed to be a genuine religious service: hymn singing, Bible readings, prayers. New arrivals, desperate and broken, probably believed they'd found spiritual salvation. But as the day wore on, the facade of piety crumbled to reveal something monstrous. Individual, counseling sessions would follow, during which Brother Cornelius extracted confessions from the penitents, confessions that went far beyond sins of the soul. These sessions often lasted hours, and the Rangers could hear the desperate pleading that leaked from the confession tent. Morrison noted in his log, "Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding. But I suspect this divine insight is rooted in more earthly sources: prolonged interrogation, psychological manipulation, and likely torture." Once the secrets were laid bare, the brothers exploited them ruthlessly. They mined details about their victims' finances, families, and any connections that could be turned into profit. They forged letters to loved ones, spinning lies to keep money flowing, sometimes maintaining these grotesque deceptions for months or even years after the victim's death. Private Thompson, who had taken position closest to the camp, reported witnessing Brother Jebediah's so-called healing sessions, which were nothing more than methodical torture designed to shatter a victim's will. "He's got a collection of tools that'd make a Spanish inquisitor proud," Thompson whispered during one of their nightly debriefs. "And he knows exactly how to use them: maximum pain, minimum chance of killing him too quick." But perhaps the most terrifying part of it all was how systematic it was. This was no fly-by-night cult or wandering gang of charlatans. This was an operation honed to a horrific perfection. They had done this before. They would do it again. And if Morrison's men failed, they would disappear into the wilderness, only to rise elsewhere under a new name, a new flock, and a new harvest of souls to damn. The same ritual had been repeated countless times in countless hidden clearings. On the second night of their surveillance, the Rangers witnessed what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their twisted euphemism for murder. A penitent, who had apparently endured days of torture, was dragged to the center of the camp. There, Brother Malachi delivered a long, fervent sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification. The victim, barely conscious and showing clear signs of prolonged abuse, was then released from earthly bonds by Brother Jebediah. In other words, executed. "They're not killing in a fit of religious madness," Morrison wrote in his report. "This is cold, calculated murder, performed with the precision of a business transaction. The religious trappings are just window dressing, designed to justify the killings and explain away the victim's disappearance." Once the so-called ascension was complete, the victim was buried in one of the numbered graves behind the camp. Brother Malachi meticulously recorded the death in a leather-bound ledger, evidence that this nightmare had likely been repeated hundreds of times over 3 decades. But Morrison's team soon discovered that murder was only part of the brothers' empire. Hidden in the woods surrounding the camp, they found a crude workshop containing forged documents and plans for other crimes. The brothers weren't just cult leaders, they were career criminals, running schemes from counterfeiting currency to multi-state fraud. "We're not just dealing with serial killers," Morrison concluded. "This is one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, using religion as a perfect front for every crime imaginable, and getting away with it for decades." On the third day of surveillance, the Rangers witnessed something that forced them to abandon their post and act immediately. A family of 4, 2 parents and 2 young children, arrived at the camp seeking family purification for trivial moral failings. The sight of children being led into that place made any further wait impossible. "I couldn't stand by and watch children become victims of these monsters," Morrison later told his superiors. "We had more than enough evidence. We had a duty to protect innocent life." Morrison's plan was to arrest the brothers during the evening service, when all 3 would be together and relatively exposed. But they quickly realized that the Damnation family, as they called themselves, had prepared for exactly this. When the Rangers moved in, they were met not only by the 3 brothers, but also by several heavily armed accomplices posing as workers. What followed was an hour-long gunfight that left 2 accomplices dead and Sergeant Crawford wounded. Even worse, the Rangers were horrified to see that some of the camp's penitents, so thoroughly broken by torture and indoctrination, actually tried to defend their captors. They begged us not to hurt their saviors, Private Thompson reported later. Some even threw themselves between us and the brothers, convinced we were agents of Satan trying to stop their purification. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. The brothers proved to be formidable opponents. Brother Malachi was an expert marksman with clear combat training. Brother Jebediah's sheer size and strength made him a lethal threat even unarmed. Brother Cornelius, while less physically intimidating, was a master manipulator, using psychological tricks to confuse and demoralize the Rangers even in the middle of battle. The turning point came when Morrison reached the tent where the brothers kept their records. Inside, he found meticulous ledgers, details of the murders, the extortion, the fraud, and something even more important, their true identities. The Damnation family was an invention. In reality, they were the Blackwood brothers, long wanted for murder and fraud across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Everything about their church was a lie. The names, the religious credentials, the testimonials, all fabricated to shield their crimes. With their real identities exposed and undeniable proof of their crimes in hand, the brothers' hold began to collapse. One by one, they were taken into custody, though not before Brother Cornelius made one last desperate move, taking one of the children hostage. In the tense standoff that followed, Morrison pleaded with Cornelius to release the child. Cornelius only smiled and said, with chilling calm, that the boy had already been marked for purification, that killing him would be an act of mercy. "You don't understand the service we provide," he told Morrison. Words that would haunt the Rangers for years to come. Brother Cornelius told Morrison with chilling calm, "These people come to us broken, sinful, worthless. We give their lives meaning by allowing them to participate in something greater than themselves. Death during purification is the highest honor we can bestow." It was Private Thompson who ended the standoff with a perfectly placed shot that wounded Brother Cornelius without harming the child. The remaining accomplices surrendered immediately, apparently recognizing that their cause was lost. With the immediate threat neutralized and the brothers finally in custody, Morrison's team began the grim task of uncovering the full scope of what they had stumbled upon. What they discovered in the hours and days that followed would exceed even their worst expectations. The evidence they found in the camp and surrounding area provided proof of criminal activity spanning more than 3 decades. The brothers' record-keeping was both meticulous and damning. Their ledgers contained detailed information about more than 400 victims, names, backgrounds, methods of execution, and the amounts of money extorted from families through fraudulent correspondence. They kept records like it was a business, Morrison reported. Each victim was assigned a number. They tracked everything: how much money was stolen, what information was extracted, even which torture methods were most effective for different types of people. It's the most coldly methodical approach to murder I've ever encountered. The physical evidence was equally horrifying. Excavation of the numbered graves revealed the remains of nearly 200 individuals, most showing signs of prolonged torture before death. The victims ranged from teenagers to elderly individuals, men and women from all walks of life. Forensic examination of the remains, conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton and a team of medical experts brought in from Austin and New Orleans, revealed the sophisticated nature of the brothers' torture methods. They had clearly studied human anatomy and psychology, Dr. Thornton reported. Their techniques were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the brothers had been experimenting with various methods of prolonged torture, apparently trying to refine their techniques for more effective interrogation. Some victims showed signs of being subjected to multiple torture methods over extended periods, suggesting that their suffering had been used as a form of research. This wasn't just about extracting money or information, Morrison concluded. I believe these men derived genuine pleasure from causing suffering. The religious framework gave them justification for their sadistic impulses while attracting a steady supply of vulnerable victims. The workshop Morrison's team uncovered provided further evidence of the brothers' criminal versatility. Alongside document forgery equipment, they found printing plates for counterfeit currency, stolen religious artifacts modified for torture, and detailed maps marking other camps the brothers had operated throughout the South. Perhaps most chilling of all was a training manual written by Brother Malachi. It detailed methods for identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals, psychological profiles of potential victims, techniques for gaining trust, and step-by-step instructions for extracting maximum value before death. They turned human exploitation into a science, Dr. Thornton observed after reading the manual. Every aspect of their operation was calculated to maximize profit while minimizing the risk of detection. It's a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. The full scope of the brothers' network became clear when investigators examined their correspondence with accomplices in other states. The Damnation family had not been operating alone. They were part of a broader criminal organization that included forgers, con artists, and even corrupt law enforcement officials who had been bribed to look the other way. Yet even with the horrors uncovered at this single camp, Morrison's team knew the brothers' crimes extended far beyond. And as word of their arrest spread, so did the chilling realization that many more secrets were waiting to be unearthed. As word spread, a flood of shocking new information poured in from across the South, revealing the true scale of the Damnation brothers' criminal empire. Letters arrived from families in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and even Indian Territory, each one describing eerily similar stories of mysterious purification camps and suspicious disappearances stretching back to the early 1840s. One such letter came from Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Mobile, Alabama. She wrote to the authorities about her husband, who vanished in 1852 after attending one of these camps, which was run by three brothers matching the Damnation's description. Samuel sent us letters for nearly 2 years after he left for the camp, she explained. He wrote about his missionary work in California and kept asking for money to fund his efforts. We sent over $800 before the letters suddenly stopped coming. Dozens of similar stories emerged, tragic tales of families duped by letters from loved ones who claimed to be spreading the gospel, only to be swindled out of their life savings. A pattern emerged. These camps operated for 6 to 12 months in isolated regions before the brothers vanished, leaving behind only rumors of successful conversions and departed missionaries. Investigators uncovered how the Damnation brothers exploited the poor communication systems of the frontier. By constantly moving their operations to remote, lawless areas, they made it nearly impossible for local authorities to connect the disappearances or gather evidence. They understood better than most lawmen how to exploit the weaknesses in our system, Investigator Morrison noted grimly in his final report. They chose their sites carefully, places where officials were outnumbered, overwhelmed, or outright corrupt, and they always moved on before anyone could catch up. Their scheme was further protected by a network of bribed sheriffs, judges, and even ministers who provided glowing endorsements, warned them of investigations, or simply looked the other way. When the conspiracy finally unraveled, several officials were exposed for accepting bribes to legitimize the brothers' missionary credentials. The financial scale of this fraud was staggering. Investigators estimated that the Damnation brothers swindled over $50,000 from desperate families, an enormous sum at the time, representing the life savings of hundreds. But the psychological toll was even more devastating. For years, families believed their sons, husbands, or brothers were nobly spreading the gospel, only to learn they had been murdered within days or weeks of arriving at the camps. Entire communities were shattered by the revelation. It's a story that forces us to ask, are humans truly capable of such calculated evil? The Damnation brothers' crimes remain a chilling testament to the darkest corners of the human heart. If this story grips you like it has thousands of others, hit that like button and subscribe for more haunting tales from America's forgotten past. And share your thoughts below. Do you think people are born evil, or is evil something they choose? But the tale doesn't end here. With mounting evidence and a furious public demanding justice, the Damnation brothers' trial would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Texas history. Every day, the courthouse overflowed with spectators, reporters, and grieving families who had traveled from all over the South to see justice done. District Attorney Robert Maxwell knew the odds were daunting. The case spanned 4 decades in multiple states, and many witnesses were long dead, some murdered by the brothers themselves. Much of the evidence came from the brothers' own meticulous records. Gentlemen of the jury, Maxwell thundered in his opening statement, you are about to hear evidence of crimes so vile, so systematically wicked, that they shake the very foundation of our faith in human nature. These men hid behind the cross while serving nothing but their own greed and depravity. In response, the defense, led by the renowned attorney James Worthington, painted the brothers not as murderers but as misguided zealots whose brutal acts were driven by twisted religious fervor. He argued they genuinely believed they were purifying souls, even if their methods were extreme. The stage was set for a legal battle that would captivate the frontier and test the limits of justice on the edge of the American wilderness. They claimed they were saving souls, and that any deaths had been the unintentional result of overly zealous religious practices. My clients are guilty of excessive zeal, perhaps even criminal negligence, Worthington argued in court. But they are not the cold-blooded killers the prosecution would have you believe. These are men so consumed by their mission to save souls that they lost sight of the limits of earthly authority. This defense strategy quickly crumbled once the prosecution began presenting testimony from survivors and reading excerpts from the brothers' own meticulous records. The evidence painted a picture not of misguided zeal but of methodical, organized brutality. Detailed financial ledgers, notes on torture methods, and records of systematic murder made it impossible to sustain the fiction of religious motivation. Brother Malachi's own testimony proved especially devastating. Rather than showing remorse or even attempting to justify his actions in spiritual terms, he spoke with chilling pride about the efficiency of their operation and their skill in avoiding detection for so long. We provided a service that society needed but was unwilling to acknowledge, Malachi testified, his voice disturbingly calm. The frontier is full of broken people with no purpose, no value, no hope. We gave their meaningless lives meaning, by allowing them to contribute to something greater than themselves. When asked by the prosecution to explain the torture and murder, Malachi's response shocked even the most seasoned court reporters. "Death is inevitable for all men," he said flatly. "We simply made sure these particular deaths served a useful purpose. The money we extracted funded important work these individuals could never have accomplished on their own." Brother Cornelius proved equally unrepentant. He described in detail how he extracted confessions and financial information, speaking as if outlining a successful business model rather than confessing to unspeakable crimes. "People want to confess," he explained matter-of-factly. "They carry guilt that poisons their souls. They're grateful for the chance to unburden themselves. My gift was knowing how to help them overcome their natural reluctance to tell the complete truth." Brother Jebediah's testimony was perhaps the most disturbing of all. He spoke of his torture methods with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his trade. "Pain is a teacher," he said, his voice steady. "It strips away pretense and reveals truth. My hands were blessed with the ability to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to achieve the desired result." The prosecution's case was further strengthened by the expert testimony of Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, who detailed the victim's injuries and the calculated nature of the torture. "These men clearly studied human anatomy and psychology," Dr. Thornton testified. "Their methods were designed to prolong suffering while keeping victims alive for as long as possible. This was the work of practiced experts, not religious fanatics." But the most powerful testimony came from the handful of survivors who had endured the brothers' so-called purification process. They gave the jury first-hand accounts of the torture, psychological manipulation, and systematic murder they had witnessed. Samuel Hartwell, the cattle driver whose 1847 statement had first raised suspicions about the camps, returned to testify despite his visible psychological scars. His voice trembled as he spoke to the packed courtroom. "They didn't just want to kill us," Hartwell whispered. "They wanted to break us completely, body, mind, and spirit. The torture wasn't just about information. They enjoyed watching us suffer." Other survivors corroborated Hartwell's story. Rebecca Marsh, a former prostitute who survived 3 weeks in one of the camps, described how the brothers broke down their victims' resistance through psychological manipulation. "They told you your suffering was necessary for your salvation," she said. "They made you feel grateful for the torture, convinced you that you deserved it. By the time they were done, you believed that dying was a mercy, and that believing it would make you one of the blessed." Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Jacob Wheeler, a former accomplice who had helped the brothers with their forgery operations before fleeing in a crisis of conscience. Wheeler's insider knowledge revealed the scale and planning behind the brothers' crimes. "They had it all mapped out," Wheeler told the jury. "They knew exactly how long they could operate in each location before suspicion would build, and they had escape routes planned for every camp. They even had contingency plans for what to do if law enforcement got too close." Wheeler's testimony revealed that the brothers had been planning to expand their operations to California and Oregon, where the gold rush had created new populations of desperate individuals who might be vulnerable to their schemes. They saw the Western migration as a business opportunity, Wheeler explained. All those people heading west with money and no family connections to track them down if they disappeared. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when the prosecution revealed the brothers' true identities and criminal histories. Court records from Arkansas showed that the men calling themselves the Damnation family were actually Jacob Cornelius and Josiah Blackwood, brothers who had been wanted for murder and fraud since 1841. The Blackwood brothers had originally operated as confidence men in Little Rock before graduating to more serious crimes. Their first known murder occurred in 1842, when they killed a wealthy merchant who had discovered their fraudulent activities. Rather than face justice, they fled west and assumed the identities of deceased ministers whose credentials they had stolen from a burned church. Everything about their religious personas was carefully constructed fiction, prosecutor Maxwell told the stunned courtroom. They studied legitimate religious practices and terminology well enough to fool even experienced ministers. Their entire identity as the Damnation family was an elaborate disguise created to provide cover for their crimes. The revelation explained many of the inconsistencies that had troubled investigators for years: the brothers' unusual interpretations of Christian doctrine, their reluctance to associate with other ministers, and their constant movement between remote settlements. Seen through this new lens, it was all the behavior of criminals maintaining false identities. DNA evidence further revealed that the man calling himself Jebediah Damnation was not actually related to the Blackwoods at all. Court records showed that Jebediah was actually Walter Grimm, a former soldier who had been discharged from the army for brutality toward prisoners during the Mexican War. Grimm had joined the Blackwood brothers sometime in the late 1840s and proved so valuable to their operations that they included him in their assumed family identity. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes so heinous, that there was no realistic possibility of acquittal. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern man who had presided over many frontier justice cases, delivered sentences that reflected the unprecedented nature of the crimes. "In my 30 years on the bench," Caldwell declared, "I have never encountered evil so systematic and calculated. Your crimes represent not only murder and fraud but an assault on the very foundations of civilized society." Jacob Blackwood was sentenced to death by hanging for 17 counts of first-degree murder. Cornelius Blackwood received the same sentence for 12 counts of murder and numerous counts of fraud and torture. Walter Grimm, brother Jebediah, was sentenced to death for 23 counts of murder, making him responsible for more confirmed deaths than either of his partners. The sentences were carried out on November 15, 1882. Before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators who had traveled from across Texas and the surrounding states to witness the executions. Even on the gallows, the 3 men showed no remorse for their crimes. Jacob Blackwood's final words were characteristic of the arrogance he had displayed throughout the trial. "We gave meaning to meaningless lives and purpose to purposeless deaths. History will vindicate our methods, even if contemporary society lacks the vision to understand them." Walter Grimm spoke last, and his final statement sent chills through the assembled crowd. "There are others like us out there. We were not unique, we were simply more successful than most. The frontier breeds predators, and there will always be those who know how to exploit the desperate and the damned." The Damnation case became a turning point in frontier law enforcement, leading to new requirements for religious organizations operating in remote areas and increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies across state lines. This is a strong, haunting narrative, but it could be made clearer, more impactful, and more compelling for your audience, especially if it's meant for a YouTube video script, podcast, or article. Here's a cleaner, polished version that keeps all your core ideas but improves flow, structure, and emotional punch. Blank. The case of the Damnation brothers highlighted the deep vulnerability of isolated frontier communities and exposed the desperate need for better communication systems to track criminals across jurisdictions. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton drew from her experience investigating the case to write one of the first comprehensive studies of criminal psychology, focusing on how systematic killers identify and exploit vulnerable victims. Her groundbreaking work laid the foundation for modern criminal profiling and victim advocacy programs. The financial damage caused by the brothers' crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families across the South, who believed they were supporting missionary work, found themselves financially ruined when they discovered their donations had funded murder and torture instead. Entire communities, once proud to sponsor what they thought was righteous evangelical work, were devastated by the revelation that their faith and charity had been weaponized against them. Captain James Morrison, whose relentless investigation brought the brothers to justice, was promoted to major and tasked with leading a new multi-state task force to pursue criminal organizations operating across state lines. His methodical approach to the Damnation investigation became a model for complex criminal cases throughout the American West. The sites of the brothers' camps remained abandoned for decades, shunned by locals who believed the ground itself was cursed by the horrors committed there. Even today, more than a century later, some remote parts of East Texas where the Damnation family operated are said to be haunted by the restless spirits of those who sought salvation and found only suffering. The story of the Damnation family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the potential for evil that lurks within seemingly civilized society. Their atrocities were made possible not just by their depravity but by a social system that failed its most vulnerable members. They exploited the gaps in frontier society, poor communication between jurisdictions, the reluctance to investigate the disappearance of drifters and outcasts, and the blind faith that religious work was inherently virtuous. They turned society's best impulses, faith, hope, and the longing for redemption, into weapons against the very people who needed protection the most. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson is that the Damnation brothers were not mere aberrations. They were the products of a system that created the perfect conditions for predatory evil to thrive. The frontier's isolation, desperation, and weak law enforcement offered opportunities that were inevitably exploited by those willing to embrace absolute darkness. Their legacy serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and the most dangerous predators are those who prey on our deepest spiritual and emotional needs. In a world where people seek meaning, purpose, and salvation, there will always be those ready to offer false redemption at the ultimate cost. The Damnation brothers promised salvation to the damned, but proved that some forms of damnation are far worse than any sin their victims ever committed. Their story lives on in unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier, a grim testament to the depths of human evil and the terrible price of misplaced trust. What do you think about this dark chapter of frontier history? Do you believe such systematic evil could exist in our modern world, or were the Damnation brothers a product of their unique time and place? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as chilling as thousands of others have, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the American frontier holds many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Share this video with someone who appreciates the shadows of history, and remember, sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as salvation. Until next time, stay vigilant against those who would exploit faith for their own twisted purposes.